There are so many traps on the waiver wire right now. Honestly, there's more bad than there is good, so we do not want to be going down the wrong direction and adding the wrong players. In this video, I'll go over all the players that we do not need to be adding that are complete traps, and make sure to stick around to the end of the video because I will be going over a quick list of players that are 100% safe to drop. So if you do like this style of video, hit that subscribe button. I'm the only one that makes these kinds of videos, and hit that like button while you are down there for some good luck in fantasy football. But the number one trap of this week is going to be Marquez Valdez-Scantling. Everybody is talking about him, and it does make sense. He finished with 3 targets for 3 receptions and 109 yards with 2 touchdowns, going for 25.9 fantasy points. I mean, that's just a good game from him all around, but honestly, we have to understand it's not sustainable. Derek Carr didn't look bad this week. He actually had his highest volume in passing with 269 yards. That's going to come down in a matter of time, especially if we don't have Chris Olave in this offense for an extended period of time, possibly the whole season. But MVS, he had a 14% team target share. That is extremely low, and this is one of those wide receiver rooms where we have 5 different guys playing at least 50% of the snaps, and nobody's really the number one guy, especially now that you don't have Olave in this offense. Even if he was on IR for the rest of the season, there's not enough of a case that can be made, and he gets tough matchups here against the Browns this week, which isn't necessarily terrible, but it wouldn't be a spot where I'd be streaming him, so we don't need to be adding MVS for that sense, and he's a great example of what can work as a real NFL wide receiver, but doesn't necessarily translate into fantasy football points. Another wide receiver we do need to be avoiding is Alec Pierce, and I understand the appeal for him because of how strong the success of Josh Downs has been. People are seeing that that can work for him and think that it can continue for the rest of these wide receivers. Last week, he saw 4 receptions on 7 targets for 81 yards and a touchdown. That's 18.1 fantasy points, leading the team in yardage. Not a bad outing by any means, but the reality of it is we didn't have Michael Pittman in the offense last week. He really hasn't looked healthy for a couple weeks now with his back injury. There is a chance that he goes on IR, but that's besides the point. Even last week, with the fact that Michael Pittman was out, him and A.D. Mitchell played the same role and are pretty much the same style of wide receiver in this offense, and he actually saw a big uptick in volume next to Alec Pierce as well. He played a career high of 94% of the snaps and ran 37 routes. That was second on the team, giving him 6 receptions for 71 yards and 13.1 fantasy points. That's not bad at all. Both of these guys are kind of similar to a Rashid Shaheed kind of style player, except the risk for these guys are a lot higher because their target consistency isn't as good and the offense is just a little bit scary. Alec Pierce has had 45 yards or less in 6 out of his 10 games that he's played this season, despite Joe Flacco being a top quarterback in passing attempts this year. We wouldn't be adding him as a streaming option either because he gets a matchup against the Jets this week, which are a tougher one. They allow the 3rd fewest points to opposing wide receivers. Even if Pittman doesn't return, he's not going to be a good option. Pierce is an even worse option because he gets bumped down the depth chart when he's healthy. So it's just not a guy we need to be looking at. A.D. Mitchell could possibly be a stash for later down the line of the season. He's younger, he has the upside, but we don't need to be looking at that just yet. But possibly one of the biggest traps of the week is going to be Rashad Bateman. I know he's been in some videos previously for the other weeks of the fantasy football season, but he deserves his flowers, I guess. He's averaged 10 fantasy points a game, and he's the wide receiver 27 right now. But last week did definitely inflate his value a bit more than usual. He finished with 6 receptions on 8 targets for 54 yards and a touchdown. Not bad by any means, but the Ravens offense, especially as of late and the success of Mark Andrews with Isaiah Likely paired together, they're running a lot more 12 personnel sets, 2 tight end sets, which leads to the offense having not 3 wide receivers on the field, but only 2. So when that does happen, Rashad Bateman is going to be moved down the depth chart, and there's going to be a little bit less room for wide receivers to get as many snaps as they get. Now, you might be looking at me and saying, well, we have Flowers, we have Rashad Bateman. They're the top 2 wide receivers in this offense, but we got to remember that they did get Deontay Johnson on their team for a reason. They didn't just sign him for nothing. Do I think that Deontay Johnson will be a league-winning wide receiver? Absolutely not. Do I think he will see more snaps? 100% I do, and that will directly impact the amount of time that Rashad Bateman sees on the field. After last week when Deontay Johnson only had 2 targets on 6 total routes, he barely played any games. The media asked John Harbaugh about his involvement and what to expect. He said that Deontay Johnson will see an increase in snaps going forward with multiple practices now under his belt. He's going to be more comfortable, and it's pretty much a given because he's barely playing over 20% of the snaps. He played 8% last week, but when the Ravens are 20th in passing attempts this year, despite scoring 35 points last week, 41, then 24, then 41, then 30, then 41 again, then 35 in their last 7 games, they're pretty much at their offensive peak. So the pass volume can't really get any better and any higher unless they want to score 50 points a game. That's just not going to happen. But despite all that, Rashad Bateman is still the wide receiver 56 in target share at 16.9% per game, and the wide receiver 57 in routes run, despite playing 70% of the snaps, which will go down when Deontay Johnson increases his snap share and actually becomes more valuable. Again, when the Ravens are playing more 2 tight end sets, there's going to be less 3 wide receiver sets, which means Rashad Bateman and Deontay Johnson are going to be fighting for that number 2 slot, eventually seeing less snaps because of that. And I'll go back to the Bengals tight end room very quickly because they are too unpredictable. Mike Gesicki comes out with 9 targets for 4 receptions on 30 yards. But then we have Tanner Hudson working his way back into this offense from injury over the last few weeks. This week, leading the team in receptions, at least the tight ends, with 7 targets, 6 receptions for 42 yards and a touchdown, 16.3 fantasy points. Even Drew Sample comes out and sees 56% of the snaps. Now, he didn't run any routes compared to Tanner Hudson and Mike Gesicki, but without T. Higgins playing, the games are completely different. Mike Gesicki, for example, is averaging a 20% team target share when he's not in the game, but when he is in the game, that number drops all the way down to 5.6%. That is a drastic difference, and even worse for other tight ends in this offense, like Eric All when he was healthy, and Tanner Hudson specifically. But in the last 5 games without T. Higgins this year, Joe Burrow is averaging 11.5 targets per game to the tight end position. With Higgins healthy in this offense, you want to know what that number drops down to? I'll let you take a guess. It's 4.8 targets to the total tight end room of every single guy. Like, that is just not good at all. Now, there is a chance that T. Higgins does miss another game this week against the Chargers, but even if he does, we now have a 2 tight end committee for the Bengals. Hudson and Gesicki are tying in routes run and targets, so it's not like one is blocking and one's receiving. They're both top guys. I do expect Gesicki to be that number 1 when T. Higgins comes back, but as we've seen previously, he's not going to see enough of a target share to really be that guy. And it is a tougher matchup against the Chargers this week, who are bottom 10 in receiving statistics allowed to the tight end position, so I wouldn't be streaming him. And the Bengals are averaging 37 points a game over their last 2 weeks. That has to come down again eventually, and that number and all of the offense has made these tight ends even more viable options. Again, it's going to come down, and all of the volume is not going to be there. But a wide receiver and tight end combo here that I'll go over very, very quickly is Jalen Polk and Austin Hooper. I know the fantasy numbers for them kind of look juicy. People could be looking at this and saying this is the Jalen Polk like resurgence of what we kind of thought he would be in the beginning of the season. But Polk had 7.2 fantasy points off 1 touchdown. It was just 1 catch for 1 touchdown. Anybody could have made that. It was a clear, simple route. He was not really guarded. Like, you could have made that watching this video. So I don't really take that as a plus for him. He was more just in the right place at the right time. This is the same guy that had a ton of dropping issues earlier in the season. That still is continuing. He played 41% of the snaps last week, but only got 1 target and almost dropped more passes than he has caught on the entire season. As for Austin Hooper, on the other hand, he's a decent option, but as long as he's splitting time with Hunter Henry, he's really not going to have any value. He doesn't have enough opportunity. It's not like this team is passing 60 times a game. Like, not like that's possible, but he's splitting time. He's splitting routes run. It's not going to be a good opportunity. He's going to get a couple passes here and there, but not enough to be starting him. A wide receiver, though, we can't leave on the waiver wire is Mike Williams. After his game-winning touchdown against my Commanders, if you see the jersey in the back behind all the on-screen text, his first game as a Steeler, he drops 10.2 fantasy points, but he is 100% a trap, pretty much guaranteed. If you look at both sides of the spectrum, yes, he only played 12% of the snaps, and he had 1 catch for 32 yards and a touchdown. Like, that's pretty good. He didn't have the opportunity to do more. How can he really be a trap? But if you look at what he was able to do on the Jets, in an offense that is number 1 in passing volume and the 9th most passing yards in the NFL, he averaged 2 receptions a game on 60% of the snaps, behind a wide receiver 1 like Garrett Wilson. Now you look at the Steelers, who are 30th in passing attempts, 27th in passing yards, where he'll be again behind a number 1 wide receiver in George Pickens. So even if he had a 90% plus route participation rate and snap percentage with this new Steelers team, which by the way he hasn't had since 2022, there's no way that he would be viable because there's such little total pass volume from Russell Wilson. Even if you isolate the games with Russell Wilson, that passing volume number is still low. Again, to cover all the bases here, he does get an amazing matchup this week against the Ravens, who are top 3 in points allowed to wide receivers and quarterbacks this week. So there is that chance, but until we've seen that he can actually secure a snap share, I'm not going to be starting him. He's not going to be viable. Now, we have seen guys this year like DeAndre Hopkins, Amari Cooper, even Deontay Johnson take a couple weeks, or are taking a couple weeks, to get their full snap share. So we can expect that to happen with Mike Williams as well. If he were to be viable, we wouldn't really know for another 2 to 3 weeks. So that would put us in about week 13. And at that point, you're playing in the fantasy football playoffs or gearing up to be there. And you probably don't need to be starting Mike Williams in that. And if you do, I don't want to be starting Mike Williams in 2024. I don't want to be starting Mike Williams in the year 2024, almost 2025, if I'm playing for a championship or even to get out of the toilet bowl if you guys play that way. But some other groups of guys here, Curtis Samuel and Mac Hollins, we're not going to be adding either of them. They both played over 85% of the snaps last week and finished with 4 receptions, a good amount of targets. Yes, the offense is efficient. They're 10th in passing yards and 3rd in passing touchdowns. But we do have Amari Cooper. We do have Keon Coleman coming back into this offense, which are going to see a regular snap count with Shakir. Those are the top 3 wide receivers. Outside of that, the hype for all these other guys are gone. They're not going to see time on field. Even if they are decent wide receivers, they're getting pushed down the depth chart. Derek Carr is a quarterback we don't need to be adding. We talked about him a little bit earlier in the video, but he saw season highs in passing yards last week. That won't continue, especially if they have no true alpha wide receivers. Taysom Hill will take some touchdowns. Alvin Kamara will take some touchdowns from him. You have a quarterback like Derek Carr. The only upside you have is passing touchdowns because he does not run the ball. So when those get taken from you, it's going to be really tough to trust him every week. John Mechie is also on here. Similarly, when Nico Collins comes back into this offense, it's going to be him. It's going to be Tank Dell. Even if we don't have Stephon Diggs for the rest of the season, the Texans run a pretty top-heavy offense. They're not going to get anybody else involved. Even without those two guys, they're still not getting him involved. So we don't need to be adding him. But a list of players that are 100% safe to drop. If you have them on your bench, get rid of them. Or if you just want to make room, Josh Palmer is going to be the first guy here. Since the Chargers bye week in week 5, he's averaged just under 10 fantasy points a game, which might look pretty decent, but Quentin Johnson was out for some of those games as well, and there's just no room for a wide receiver 3 in this offense, especially considering that Will Dissly is getting involved in the receiving game as well. The pass volume has increased, but not enough to be starting a wide receiver 3. Nick Westbrook-Akine is another guy here. Will Levis is just not a good quarterback. Even if he's supporting Calvin Ridley just a little bit, there's not going to be enough room, again, or enough volume for him to be viable on a week-to-week basis. Joe Flacco is on this list. You can drop him if you have him. There's other quarterbacks that we can stream that are better than him. He gets a little bit of tough matchups here in the next 2 weeks with the Jets and the Lions, so there's no point to be doing that. But that is going to finish off this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you in the trade targets and stash videos coming later this week.